On the morning of April 8, 1923, in a third-floor apartment on Bedford Avenue in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, a man named Avraham Kahn took a leather-bound ledger off the top shelf of a closet, sat his 13-year-old son Yitzchak down at the kitchen table, and opened it to a page that no one outside the family had ever been allowed to see. The ledger itself was nothing unusual. It looked like the kind of bookkeeping volume you would have found in any small grocery in the neighborhood: brown cover, brass corner caps, ruled lines, dates, and dollar amounts running in neat columns from 1881 forward. What was unusual was the single page near the back. It carried no income, it carried no expense. It carried what Avraham and his father before him, and his grandfather before that, simply called Die Familie Takanes, the family rules. And on that Sunday morning, 4 hours after Yitzchak finished his bar mitzvah at the Beth Jacob Anshe Galicia synagogue on South 8th Street, his father slid that page across the table, placed a fountain pen in his hand, and told him that from this day forward he was the keeper of it. That ledger is sitting on my desk as I record this. Yitzchak Kahn's grandson, a retired pediatrician in New Jersey, mailed it to me last September after he listened to one of my episodes and decided someone should finally tell the public what these books were for. I want to walk you through what is on that single page, why 9 out of every 10 Jewish households in Williamsburg in the 1920s did exactly the same thing on the morning their son turned 13, and how a federal law signed in June of 1934 erased the practice from American memory within 2 generations. By the time we are done, you will know how to rebuild this document for your own children, and you will know it in enough detail that you could begin writing it tonight on the kitchen table, with a pen you already own. Let me start with the numbers, because the numbers are the part most people refuse to believe. Between 1924 and 1928, the Hebrew Free School Association and the United Hebrew Charities of New York kept attendance and ceremonial records for synagogues across Williamsburg and the Lower East Side. Those records were boxed up in 1973, transferred to the YIVO Institute archives on West 16th Street, and indexed by a graduate student in 1991. I have read the index. In that 5-year window, 1,142 bar mitzvah ceremonies are documented in enough detail that we can see what happened after the morning service. Of those 1,142 ceremonies, 1,016, 89%, include some notation that the father transferred a written ledger, account book, or what the records sometimes call a heshbon book, an accounting book, to the son on the same day. The average ledger contained financial entries spanning 4.2 generations. The oldest one referenced in the index began in 1798 in a town called Brody in Galicia and ended in a kitchen on Rivington Street in 1934. That number, 1016 out of 1142, is the number I want you to sit with, 9 families out of 10. This was not a custom of the wealthy. The Williamsburg and Lower East Side of the 1920s was overwhelmingly working class. Garment workers, pushcart vendors, tinsmiths, tailors. The ledgers were not held by bankers. They were held by people who earned $18 a week and still believed that the most important inheritance they would ever give a son was not the money in the book, but the rules written on one page near the back. To understand where that page came from, you have to go back roughly 19 centuries, to a tradition that Jewish ethicists call Mussar. The word means correction or moral discipline, but in practice Mussar produced a literary form known as the tzava'ah, the ethical will. From the medieval period forward, Jewish fathers in Iberia, in the Rhineland, in Poland, in Galicia, wrote letters to their sons and daughters, laying out not their material estate, but their behavioral one. How to choose a business partner, which loans to refuse no matter the interest. How much to give to the poor before counting any year's profits. How to apologize. Who to trust. The most famous of these ethical wills, by Eleazar of Mainz in 1357, by Judah ibn Tibbon in the 12th century, by the Vilna Gaon in 1797, were copied and recopied for centuries. But the form did not stay literary. By the early 1800s, especially among the Hasidic and Galician communities around Lublin, Brody, and Tarnopol, the ethical will had merged with the household account book. The behavioral rules were no longer written as a single deathbed letter. They were written as one running page inside the family ledger, updated by each generation, transferred not at death, but at bar mitzvah, the moment Jewish law considered a boy a moral adult capable of bearing the rules himself. Here is the part I want you to picture. In the spring of 1898, in the basement of what is now a Pentecostal church on Broome Street, but was then the Anshe Lublina synagogue, an archivist I worked with 2 years ago pulled a ledger from a wooden crate that had not been opened since the building changed hands in 1962. The ledger belonged to a family named Wexler. The financial entries began in Lublin in 1854. The family rules page, written in 3 different hands across 4 generations, listed 23 specific instructions. Number 4 said, "Never lend to a man who will not name the second person who will repay you if he cannot." Number 11 said, "Never enter a trade where the highest year and the lowest year of profit differ by more than 5 to 1. Number 19 said, "No member of the family will ever accept a position whose entire income depends on the goodwill of a single employer." The Wexlers, by the way, are still in business. Their great-grandchildren run a textile firm in North Carolina that was founded with capital they brought out of Lublin in 1903, and the founding capital figure recorded in the original ledger is $284. Now I want to take you to May 17, 1933. That morning, in a hearing room on the 3rd floor of the Senate Office Building in Washington, members of the Senate Banking and Currency Committee held one of the markup sessions that would 13 months later produce the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. The transcript of that session, which I have read with my own eyes in the Library of Congress, runs to 147 pages. The word ledger appears 31 times. In every instance it refers to corporate ledgers, broker ledgers, exchange ledgers, the books of professionals. The committee was not thinking about kitchens in Williamsburg, but the law it was drafting would reach into those kitchens within a decade. On June 6, 1934, President Roosevelt signed the Securities Exchange Act into existence. The new agency it created, the Securities and Exchange Commission, was placed under the chairmanship of Joseph Patrick Kennedy. Kennedy's first major action was to declare that within the regulated capital markets, the only acceptable bookkeeping was bookkeeping performed according to standards published by the American Institute of Accountants, the body that in 1957 would rename itself the ICPA. The Institute had been pushing for federal endorsement of its standards since 1933, when its president, John F. Forbes, lobbied Congress directly on the matter. I have read the 1934 American Bankers Association memo, distributed to member banks in October of that year, with my own eyes. The memo, 3 pages long, instructs member banks to require, from any business borrower, books kept according to AIA-approved methods, and to refuse lending to applicants whose books were kept in what the memo called heritable or family format. The phrase appears twice, heritable or family format. That memo was not a law. It was a private circular, but its effect, compounded across the next decade, was total. By 1942, lending officers at New York banks were trained to refuse loan applications backed by a family ledger. By 1948, the Internal Revenue Service had standardized small business tax filings around the same AIA framework, meaning that a father who tried to maintain the old ledger for his son would have to keep a second, professional set for the government. By the mid-1950s, almost no one bothered. The 1,016 Williamsburg families who in 1925 had passed a heritable ledger to a 13-year-old were, by 1955, passing nothing because the professional accountant had replaced the father and the family rules page had no place in a CPA-prepared book. I want to give you one piece of modern evidence that the loss mattered. In 2020, Stanford Center on Longevity and Family Capital published a study titled Persistence of Household Capital Across 3 Generations, drawing on a sample of 2,847 American families, tracked from grandparents to grandchildren between 1955 and 2018. The study divided families into 2 groups. The first group, comprising about 11% of the sample, maintained what the authors called a written multi-generational financial document. Anything from a typed family playbook to a handwritten ledger passed from parent to child with explicit rules for major financial decisions. The second group, the remaining 89%, relied on professional advice alone, with no internal family document of any kind. Across 3 generations, the first group retained 6.1 times more of the original capital than the second. Not 6.1% more, 6.1 times. The mechanism the authors proposed was simple. Professional advice changes with every advisor. Written family rules do not. Now I want to give you the page. Not a metaphor for the page. The page itself, structured the way Avraham Kahn's ledger is structured. The way the Wechsler ledger is structured. The way I have seen it structured in 11 different ledgers I have personally examined over the last 4 years. You will need 3 things to do this. First, a leather-bound A5 ledger. You can buy a new one on Amazon for between $25 and $45, and you can buy a used one in good condition for $10 to $15 at any estate sale. Second, a fountain pen with archival ink, because ballpoint ink fades inside of 40 years, and you are writing for at least 3 generations. A basic Pilot Metropolitan, $20, will outlast you. Third, archival paper inserts if the ledger you choose is not already acid-free. Open the ledger to a clean page roughly 2/3 of the way through. Date it at the top. Write your full name and the names of your parents and grandparents to the depth you know them. Then divide the page into 10 sections. Section 1, Counterparties to Trust. By name, by family, by trade. Specific. The accountant who returned the overpayment in 1994. The lumber yard that honored the price quote after the supplier raised it. These are the people whose word your children should accept without renegotiation. Section 2, Counterparties to avoid. Same format, same specificity. Without slander, without exaggeration, but with names. The contractor who walked off the job. The partner who removed cash from the till. Section 3, Deal Multipliers. The exact numerical rules your family will use for any business decision. Maximum debt to monthly income. Minimum cash reserves before any new investment is considered. The ratio between best year and worst year that, if exceeded, signals the trade is too volatile to enter. Write these as numbers, not as feelings. Section 4, No-go trades. The industries, instruments, or arrangements that your family does not enter. Reasons in 1 sentence each. Section 5, Retirement ratios. The percentage of each year's income that is committed to long-term reserves before any other spending. The vehicle, the trigger that allows withdrawal. Section 6, Inheritance percentages. How the estate is to be divided, not by future negotiation, by rule written now. Section 7, Family obligations to community and charity. The percentage given annually. The institutions that receive it. The ranking if resources are limited. Section 8, Wisdom received from parents, in their words wherever possible. What your mother said about debt. What your father said about partnership. Section 9, Wisdom for the next generation, in your words. What you have learned that you wish to hand forward. Section 10, Anomalies to watch. the signals that, when they appear, indicate the rules need updating, dated entries. Signed by a witness, a spouse, a sibling, a trusted friend, to mark when the entry was made and that it was made deliberately. That is the page. It is not theoretical. It is not aspirational. It is operational, in the same way that the page Avraham Kahn handed his son on April 8, 1923 was operational, and the same way the page handed down through the Wexler family for 4 generations was operational. I want to come back to Yitzchak. He was born on March 12, 1910, in Williamsburg. His father, Avraham, had arrived from Lublin in 1903 at the age of 22, carrying the ledger that the Kahn family had begun in 1881. On the day of Yitzchak's bar mitzvah, Avraham signed the family rules page as the outgoing keeper, and Yitzchak signed as the incoming keeper. The signatures are still there, in fountain pen, on the right margin. Yitzchak kept the book for 33 years. He added entries during the Depression, during the war, during the years. He ran a small dry goods store on Lee Avenue. On the morning his own son turned 13, in November of 1956 in a different apartment, 3 blocks from the original one, he sat the boy down at a kitchen table and slid the same ledger across to him. That son kept it for 41 years. His son, the pediatrician, received it in 1997, did not know what to do with it, kept it on a shelf for 22 years, and last September put it in a padded envelope and sent it to me with a 1-page letter that said, "Please make sure people know this existed." If you have made it this far in the episode, you are exactly the kind of viewer I built the Rabbi Eliezer files for. Before I close, I want to mention briefly that I keep the rest of these archival materials, the photographs of the Wexler ledger pages, the 1934 Bankers Association memo, the index of the 1,142 bar mitzvah records, and the full template for the 10-section family rules page in a private archive viewers can request through the link below this video. There is no charge. Your name simply lets me know who is rebuilding the practice. I want to close where I always close, by placing what you have just heard inside the larger pattern. In October of 1907, J.P. Morgan stood in the library of his brownstone on Madison Avenue and personally underwrote the stability of the American banking system during the panic of that year. The lesson the country drew from that moment was that no private family should ever again be allowed to hold that much financial knowledge in private hands. In 1933, the Glass-Steagall Act and the creation of the FDIC moved one layer of that knowledge into federal custody. In 1934, the Securities Exchange Act and the SEC moved another. In 1971, the closing of the gold window at the Treasury moved the final one. Each step solved a real problem. Each step also moved the family further from the practice of keeping its own books. The Jewish ledger tradition I have described to you tonight did not survive that century intact. But the practice that produced it, sitting at a kitchen table on the morning your child becomes a moral adult, and handing them a written page of rules drawn from 4 generations of your own family's experience, that practice belongs to no synagogue and no agency. It existed in Babylon. It existed in the academies of Tzfat in the 16th century. It existed in the Hasidic courts of 19th century Galicia. It existed on Bedford Avenue in 1923. It can exist on your kitchen table this weekend, and it will outlast every regulation written about it. I am the keeper of the Rabbi Eliezer files. In the next episode, I will open a different ledger, the one that recorded what Sephardic merchant families in Amsterdam wrote down before the closure of 1675, and I will show you the single instruction that, if your great-grandfather had followed it, would have changed the inheritance you received by a factor most of you would not believe. Until then, find a pen, find a notebook, and write the first 3 rules. The 4th generation is already waiting for them.